r/us credit. Prison guards of Reddit, what it the most extreme thing you ever saw happen in your prison? Between fights, suicides, attempted suicides etc. Worst one that got me was I cut down a hanger. He went into fight mode swinging at us. We got him to the ground and handcuffed him and pinned him on the floor. He started to cry begging us to kill him as we tried to keep him from banging his head on the floor. That was my first hanging and stuck with me ever since. Edit. Since people are mentioning how depressing this thread is, I gotcha. I was working a pod and had someone throw a melted down shoe heel in a sofa can at me. Think hot melted rubber. It mainly got on my shirt, so I was fine, but started fighting with the guy. I had him pinned on the ground with 64 offenders around me. I had lost my cuffs in the fight, they had fell out away from me. Another offender I had known for a while assisted me, handing me my cuffs and holding the guy's legs down. I was able to drag that one offender out due to the fact the offenders on the pod were throwing stuff at us. The offender who helped me got his time reduced and I wrote him a letter for the parole board and spoke on his behalf. He got out, works a good woodworking job, $24 an hour, and writes to the prison with updates on how he is doing. He has a girlfriend and a baby on the way. Happiest story I have of that place. Not a co, but no maintenance staff. One inmate had a court date so left for the day. Apparently during his day out he managed to acquire a loose screw, not big or anything. Apparently he found it on the floor of the transport van. Anyway, once back in his cell he decides to use the screw to drill a hole in the plexiglass window of his door. Mind you, the doors are a layer of plexiglass and then steel grating. Anyway, he drills 2 holes, one at the top and one at the bottom of about a 2 feet tall window. He does this between co-patrols who are supposed to do a walk around every 15 minutes. The inmate then proceeds to tear his bedding and ravel it into a string, which he feeds through the upper hole and back down through the lower hole using the friction of the bedding. He literally saws a giant hole in the plexiglass using nothing but his bedding. When questioned, he informed the guards that this took him roughly 11 hours to accomplish without a single co noticing it. He didn't escape. Like I said, there is still the steel grating. He literally just did this as a fuck you to the guards, and he had the spare time. I have a family member who worked as staff, not a guard, at a state prison in California. Their job required them to work inside the prison. This was in 2010. There was another staffer who worked there. We'll call her Samantha. Samantha was an attractive 30-year-old who was happily married and had 2 kids. She was generally well liked and nobody thought her behavior was strange or different. One day the prison started having a major issue with cell phones being smuggled in. Lots of cell phones. The prison launched a huge investigation complete with shakedown, squeezing troublemaker inmates, the whole 9 yards. In one of the sweeps they found a love note between one of the inmates and Samantha. For anybody who doesn't know, prison guards and staff are absolutely prohibited from any sex with inmates. It's a serious crime that is prosecuted on a frighteningly regular basis. Turns out Samantha was not only having a sexual relationship with the inmate who had the letter, but she was having sex with 6 other inmates. So, she was fucking and exchanging long love letters with a total of 7 inmates simultaneously. One of the inmates had convinced her to smuggle in cell phones through the dry cleaning inmate work program. They estimate she smuggled in at least 50 phones this way. One of the other inmates she was involved with had been having his drug dealing proceeds from the street deposited into her personal savings account on the outside, so they had money to run away together. When the inmate got out, the inmate was serving a 17-year prison term. When this was discovered, there was major fallout for the staff and inmates at the prison. Security was tightened considerably, the dry cleaning work program was suspended, and Samantha was arrested and eventually sentenced to just over 3 years in prison. The craziest thing about the whole situation? Samantha's husband stayed with her. She got out of prison several years ago, and they are a seemingly happy family once again. I was working in the X house. My prison had 3 areas: general population, STC for somewhat mentally unstable I/Ms, and the X house, shaped like an X, for seriously mentally ill guys that would throw poop, cut themselves, etc. I was on the seg wing. Even though most cells in the X house were like seg anyway, this area had another officer to watch it specifically. So I was called over to watch a guy who had been placed on continuous suicide watch. He was completely naked with nothing else in his cell. And I have to stand just outside the door and watch him. So he's trying to do everything to get a reaction out of me, but I'm Stonerface Phillips, documenting every 5 minutes what he's doing. He climbs up on the bed, takes his dick in one hand and starts stroking. He takes a finger from his other hand and wets it in his mouth. The now wet finger goes behind him, right into his ass. And then he starts yelling my last name. We all have NAMA tags. Awanak 30, Awanak 30, Awanak 30. Then after he's done doing that, he walks up to the door. These are steel doors with just a window for seeing into the cell. We're basically face to face with this window between us. Just below the window is a chuck hole, which is a tiny door for passing food trays through. Thankfully it was closed, because I look down at the chuck hole and see yellow liquid coming out from the sides of it. I took a few steps back and continued my watch. I wasn't gonna let him get a reaction out of me. Currently a co. I work in one of the reformed mental health facilities for my state. Basically we are a prison with a strong focus on mental health rehabilitation. We deal with some of the state's finest, worst cases. I've seen a man with a literal hole in his body from his chest to below his belly button. He put it there. It started after he ripped his intestines out and bit through them. He then proceeded to enlarge the hole slowly over time. Longest 4-point restraint inmate in the state's history. Also seen a guy shove a 4-foot headphone extension cord through his D***K and into his bladder not once, not twice, but 5 times now. He's also gouged his eye out. I've got stories like these for days. I wish our state had that. I was in jail for 8 months, and I met 2 guys that really should have been in a mental hospital. One guy was schizophrenic and thought that his dead brother had been implanted in his chest. He also believed that he had circuit boards implanted in his skull that received a signal from an orbiting satellite that told him when to breathe. Despite the fact that they didn't show up on x-rays. He was locked up for possessing burglary tools. The court had ordered him sent to a mental institution, but there were no available beds, and so he just sat in jail waiting to be transferred. Another kid that was there had a serious split from reality. He was in for stealing a car that had been left running while the workers were doing road work. He talked constantly. Just this incoherent nonsense every minute that he was awake. Stuff like, they say the world is coming. Do you think the Facebook people will arrest me for talking to a girl I like? Okay, we are going to drop the beat now, take a listen. Everyone needs to know what they are talking about, so grab a chair and listen up. The sensei has said it's time to practice, but I'm not going to get caught walking around town. Time to flip it over and bring it around. Just on and on every single minute non-stop. The guys who were in the cells adjacent to his went nuts because they couldn't read or sleep with his constant monologues that made no damn sense. He would frequently walk around the cafeteria talking on his ID badge like it was a phone. I talked to him a few times and he could bring himself back to reality, but it was real struggle. He refused to shower and refused to take his meds because he just didn't trust them. Most of the guys felt sorry for him and kept an eye out for him, but wouldn't get too close because you could smell his funk 10 feet away. I, female, teach, volunteer in a minimum security male prison. Security level of an incarcerated person doesn't correlate directly with the crimes they are incarcerated for. It's more about their public safety risks, such as reoffending. What that means is my class of minimum security guys has all sorts of offenders in it, including rape, child abuse, murder. Our class is held a few times a week in a separate building than the main prison, trailer/portable. My MO Street XTRME story is one from springtime. It couldn't have been a more gorgeous day, and everyone was chatty about it. Suddenly, a bit of commotion in the back of the class. Hey, miss up. Hey teacher lady. I head to the back of the trailer. To check things out, everyone's gathered around a window. What? Is there some new co on the block, or maybe a transfer inmate they are all ragging on? I swear these guys are just, I thought to myself, preparing for some juvenile nonsense. At that moment, I saw what they could see, a mama cat and her 3 kittens trotting across the yard and settling in under some daffodils for a nap. A collective rose up from the trailer, quickly covered up with abrupt subject changes, shit talking and class questions, of course. I can't help but smile every time I think about it. Moral of the story, they're just people. Maybe they did some shitty things, like real shitty things, or maybe they didn't, and they're in there wrongly. Maybe they've been rehabilitated, or maybe they haven't. Hell, maybe they never will be. But everyone likes kittens. Edit. Formatting. A word. I have many stories, and many about this particular prisoner, but one stands out to me the most. Doing a count one day, everyday stuff, and it involves looking through trap windows to make sure everyone is present and breathing. Get to this prisoner's cell. Let's call him Prisoner X. Now this prisoner has a long history of sexual abuse from his childhood. As a result, he is an absolutely chronic masturbator. The amount of times I've had to have conversations with him while he is going to town on his hambone are innumerable. Anyway, doing a count with a female officer, she looks through the trap and immediately recoils. Now all I can hear is a loud buzzing sound and the sounds of furious masturbation. I decide to check the trap against the warnings of my offsider. Should have listened. Turns out he was using the unit's hair clippers. But he had them wrapped in a glove, turned on and shoved squarely up his ass. All I could see was the cord plugged into the wall leading into his loudly buzzing anus and him giving his old fella the exercise of its life. Edit. Yes. Fuck. I understand I never ended up referring to him as X. I thought I would at start of the story, and then didn't. I'm gonna leave it up there though, because I can actually take criticism as well as X can take a pair of clippers. Am correctional officer, but still in training. Told this story by my instructor, who was a co for 15 years. He was working in segregation, essentially solitary confinement, but not that extreme in the sense that the inmates here do get to converse with other inmates, and do get to populate outside during rec time for only 2 hours each day. But anyways, one of the inmates also had mental health issues, and after 15 days serving in segregation, psychological issues can form. So it got past 3 weeks and this inmate, who was already did not have a sane mind, went absolutely crazy. Took a razor blade and started to cut open his arm until he got to the vein and cut it out and threw it at the door window, smearing it in blood so the co's couldn't see inside the cell. Once that happens, they have to suit up in protective gear and enter the cell with a body-sized shield. After pulling him out and sending him to medical to get treatment, he is sent back to his cell after the stitches were sewn. 2 hours pass, and the inmate takes another razor blade and starts cutting open his stomach. These blades aren't the strongest, they are very flexible, so it takes time to actually force it straight enough to cut, if removed from the shaving device. He began to cut and spent hours until he cut open his stomach and began to pull out his own intestines. It was a cycle of him going to medical and getting stapled up and going back to his cell to open his wounds back up until he was put in a turtle suit, straitjacket. These types of experiences aren't abnormal for mental health patients being put in segregation. Not me and not a prison guard, but one of my college professors used to teach at a prison. She was a Portuguese/literature teacher for them. This happened in Brazil. She was teaching the inmates, all male, about poetry, and it was close to Mother's Day, so she told them to write a poem about their own mothers. This was in a very impoverished area, and she told us all the inmates were illiterate before she started with them. One of the inmates wrote a beautiful poem about his deceased mother that was killed right before he was arrested when he was much younger. He was arrested for killing his father, who murdered his mom. All the inmates started clapping and whistling because it was so beautiful and heartbreaking, but then the guards went nuts thinking they were messing around and started beating the inmates so they would shut up. Classes were cancelled after that. My professor said it was all very shocking. It was a pure scene with people bonding and learning, and the guards resorted to violence without even thinking. She never went back to teach at her prison again. I was a mailroom employee at the unit in Texas that houses death row. For security reasons, most of death row inmates had their mail constantly scanned or read, while other inmates just had them searched for contraband. This whole process was a knee-jerk process out in place after a governor was threatened from Drive. Then bringing the mail to the inmates and telling them you read it and found some shit was terrifying because they obviously never liked and often threatened violence. The stuff you read is fucking insane. I read plenty of neo-Nazi plots to help bring in the New World Order, stuff that was completely encoded in their own little systems, and all sorts of absolutely depressing shit. The worst one I ever read had to have been the one of an inmate who was scheduled for execution the next day and was sending a bunch of fuck you letters to the victim's family, as if they hadn't been through enough. I know this will get drowned, but if anyone has any questions about it, I'm happy to answer. Edit. The families would not receive those letters. They were sent to an ombudsman after being screened, and typically to law enforcement past that. The only way those families would receive it is if they filed a subpoena to get them, I imagine. Somewhat speculation, but I'm fairly certain that is a process. Sorry for any spelling errors in any replies, I'm on mobile. I was the co about 18 years ago at a maximum pen for 14 to 24 year olds. It was insane to me that such young kids could be locked up with adults. We had a lot of construction going on in the prison and they would bring in older convicts to do the work. One day a young guy started talking shit to an older one and the older guy hit him in the face with a coffee pot. Lots of cuts and lots of burns. Another time one of the construction guys snuck a welding rod back into the prison and used it to stab another inmate through his throat. I'll never forget that. I couldn't tell who the victim was because of the amount of blood. Surprisingly, he survived. I was personally involved in 2 extreme situations. One came my first night being alone after training. A group of 5 inmates jumped me. First one hit me in the back of my head and I went blind for a second. I couldn't get my bearings, but I knew I needed to get to the unit door so the guard upstairs could let me out and lock them in. I ran for the door covering my head and luckily got out. When I was trying to shut the door, which was a large steel door with bolts that shot out to lock it, when it got close to being closed I shot one of the inmates' feet in it. It crushed his foot. IDK if they were able to save his foot. He was transferred from the hospital to another facility. Then one other time a guy didn't want to go back into his cell, so he tried to fight me. We were on a balcony about 12 feet up. Imagine a 2nd floor outdoor hotel. There was a line of cells on the 1st floor with stairs on each end that led up to a line of cells in the 2nd floor. Anyway, he was trying to push me over the railing. We wrestled for a bit, but when he tried to push me off I started hitting him. In the scuffle he ended up trying to run and jumped over the railing. I think he wanted to kill himself, but he landed on both feet which broke both of his ankles. Prison is real lame for all involved. Aussie correctional officer here. Most extreme would be seeing a mate and fellow officer narrowly miss get stabbed in the neck with a pen. Luckily it hit cheekbone and ricocheted up behind his left ear. Sliced that open though. He's a tough bloke who's been through much worse in the defense force overseas, and he was back at work the next day like nothing happened. Also saw an inmate beaten to within an inch of his life by 2 other inmates over a drug debt. Blood everywhere. Inmate didn't move until a few seconds before the response team got there. Felt like forever, but was about 30 seconds. Looked dead. Funniest would be one of our more psychotic inmates in a suicide prevention cell. Toilet/shower area were blocked off because he continually flooded his cell/less vision. He is known for producing the largest shits you've ever seen. Gotta be known for something, I guess. Without immediate access to his toilet he decided to lay the ungodly log in the middle of his cell for all to see. Without exaggerating, this thing was 2 Coke cans together. Easy. He left it for about 10 minutes and then proceeded to use his ripped up shirt as a balaclava and gloves so he could pick it up. He then threw it with force at the ceiling, which is about 4 meters high. It stuck for a good 15 minutes. It took a lot of persuading to move him without use of force. He was handcuffed to the door to move him to a clean cell, and as the door opened the log fell and made a distinct thud of the floor. Everyone including the inmate had a good giggle at the whole situation. Was, for a short time, a co-at a LVL3 institution in the south. 23-year-old was refused a second peanut butter sandwich because he was no longer on a diet per the doctor. Decided to get completely naked, cover himself head to toe in his own peanut butter, and stab one of my academy buddies in the shoulder with a paper clip. We then had to gas him and execute a forced cell extraction. 5 guys in riot gear had to take this guy down, which he was naked and covered in shit. This was my second extraction. Inmate was insulted by another and decided to retaliate by putting a cup of Vaseline in the microwave and then throwing in the guy's face, leaving him with serious 3rd-degree burns on his face and in his mouth. Dude got his eye socket caved in shortly after that. We held most of the cutters in the state. These guys were very knowledgeable of the vascular system in the human body, would cut only what they needed to get high. Once in a while some guys would miss and hit a big artery. Watched a dude right after he hit in the main artery inside his elbow. Projectile blood must have been well over a foot in the air. Watched him slowly sag down a wall while passing out. We had to squeegee the congealed blood off the floor, buckets of it. Not my favorite memory. This was the worst. One of the cutters as mentioned above liked to open his abdomen. Big opening like 6 inches wide. One day we heard him complaining about a stomach ache and told him to suck it up. He kept on about it, so we went to check it out. He had opened his stomach up and shoved trash and light bulb pieces inside of himself. I believe he had a crush on one of the nurses at the hospital and this was his ticket to see her. That's love. Alright, so I was looking for a job some years back. Any job. I ended up catching on as a teacher in a youth prison. Basically this place was populated by all boys, age 14 to 16 I think. Something like that. My job was as computer lab administrator, where they took pre-gen and other computerized tests. There were some other teachers there as well that taught other classes. I was a staff member of the school portion of the institution. Tame, yes, but still a prison. I had to be searched to enter the premises. Phone had to stay in the car, etc. So I went through the general prison guard training for 2 weeks at another prison. Self-defense training, the whole 9 yards. I went through that with newly hired guards for the state prison, etc. I start my stint at the youth facility and everything is going okay. We're outside the fence on lunch smoking cigarettes, and one of the actual guards tells me there are 2 or 3 new students coming that day, and ask me if I wanted to watch. Watch, I said. Watch what? He explains that when they first arrive they shave their head and strip them down naked and really embarrass them. This place was a military boot camp style facility. The more he describes this process I just get sick to my stomach. It was at this point that I recognized that, while corrections may be a necessary part of our society, it is one that is certainly not for me. For a variety of reasons I ended up leaving the job a few days later. Not me but my dad, who was a warden for years. Dad opened up a prison that was developed by a for-profit incarceration company, and it was quite the shit show when my dad was brought on. Even the construction had problems. Things like you could see from the men's showers directly into the women's showers and vice versa. He had entirely new staff, new to corrections, fresh out of the academy, besides him and his second. Anyway, the week the facility opened, i.e. the week they got inmates, Dad's second comes into his office. "You've got to see this, Tom." "See what?" "I'm busy, Bob." "You really have to come down and see this." Dad goes down to the block, and inmates aren't exactly rioting, but they are all out of their cells, refusing to follow orders, talking shit, getting worked up. And Dad's green staff is cowering in the control room. 300 inmates are pressing into the doors, getting loud and rowdy. My dad looks at the situation. His staff, his second, says stay on my 6, and wades in. All the instigators are at the front of this crowd, but Dad doesn't engage them at all. He elbows his way through, goes straight to the back where there are inmates who don't really give a shit, but like to watch the ruckus. The leaders of the proto riot are stuck on the other side of the crowd, and my dad starts shouting commands. What are you doing out of your cell when we are on lockdown? Get back to your cell for roll call. etc etc. People at the back start to disperse, and that gains momentum until it's just the few instigators, and now you can deal with the handful left plus they lost all their supporters. My dad is either really brave or really stupid, but prison stories are still my favorite. I work in a hospital near a prison. These guys will gash their scrots from dick to gooch for a trip out to see us, and they'll do it in teams. Been happening for years. Bunch of guys fire M's with their self-bloodied gooders hanging out. Cells get tossed more often over there now, because we're not a huge hospital, and they do it in the middle of the night, which can really tie up our staff, which makes other patients wait, or causes us to go on divert status. Dispatch diverts M's to other hospitals, because our resources are tied up, for a brief time. Anyway, about 2 weeks ago, one of these guys got an extended stay with us due to sepsis after his wound became infected. Since I work here and ICU, I was able to follow his case. Scrotal edema is pretty common in the ICU due to large amounts of fourth fluid and the way patients are positioned in the bed. This guy's balls would not heal. The wound just festered and wept and stank. He eventually had to have surgery to remove a bunch of necrotic tissue, inside and out, from scrot, gooch, thigh, and part of one ass cheek. Almost died. And he really just carried himself like a regular guy through his entire stay. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Please leave a like and subscribe.